Now say something.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, good.
So welcome everybody to the Occupy Chicago's teach-in series. We have so many awesome teach-ins, study groups, things like that planned. This is one in the series of many. We've had many going before, we'll have many coming after this. So this is co-sponsored by the Gender Equity Committee of Occupy Chicago, as well as the Education Committee of Occupy Chicago. So my name's Brit Schulte.
I'm Erica Friscioni.
And we'll be facilitating the meeting. We're going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have like a little over an hour for discussion and debate, dissent, and get all those ideas going. So the title of the talk is "You Can't Make Half a Revolution: Why Women's Liberation is Central to Occupy." And also, I might be kind of grabbing somebody out of the audience to help take stack, because somebody on the Education Committee could come and help moderate discussion. So I see a lot of familiar faces that we'll be able to draw on to help us out. Awesome. Thanks so much. I'll be calling you out later. Great. So without further ado, go ahead and get started. So we're here today to discuss the goals, ambitions, and obstacles of the Occupy movement from the perspective of the politics of women's liberation. We aim to demonstrate that these politics are essential in building an effective and representative movement of economic and social equality. The main sections of our talk will take up the origin of women's oppression, the economics of oppression, violence, and fight back. Now, before outlining the roots of women's oppression, we need to define oppression and explain how it manifests itself. Oppression holds the key to exploitation as being an exercise in fostering divisions in a cruel and burdensome way. It not only fosters these divisions, but it also impedes our comprehension of what is being done to us. Oppressions are ways in which the 1% divides the working class and poor people in order to conquer us all. Oppressions don't exist as independent or unattached realities in society, and society as a whole suffers from these oppressions. Now, I'm going to, for this talk, draw upon Marx and Engels' ideas about the origin of women's oppression, which rejected outright the perspective that the low status of women was an unchanging feature of human existence, fixed for all time by human biology or by the ideas in people's heads. Now, Marxism's understanding of history views human beings as not only products of the natural world, but as active agents, able to interact with their environments, affecting change within themselves, their social structures, and the natural world around them. This understanding doesn't mesh very well with the flawed perspective that holds women as always being inferior, because it looks at the evidence of the evolution of human history and development. So we gotta face facts on a couple of things. Women's oppression is a relatively recent historical development and stems from the rise of class society, the family, and the role of women's unpaid reproductive labor. I'm using recently to reference the past 10,000 years or so out of the hundreds of thousands of years of human history and development. Women's status in society has always been related to the role that they have played in the family and the various forms that the quote-unquote family has taken in history. The shift towards agricultural production, sharply increased the productivity of labor. This, in turn, increased the demand for labor because the greater number of field workers meant the higher the yield. Thus, unlike previous hunter-gatherer societies, which sought to limit the number of offspring, agricultural societies sought to maximize women's reproductive potential so the family would have more children to help out with work. Therefore, at the same time that men began playing an increasingly exclusive role in production, women were required to play a much more central and specific role in reproduction. Now, the rigid sexual division of labor remained the same, but production shifted away from the household, and the family was no longer serving anything but a reproductive function. It became an economic unit of consumption for society. Women became trapped within their individual families as the reproducers of society, cut off from the means of production. Now, these changes took place first among the property-owning families, the first ruling class, but eventually the nuclear family became a reflective economic unit of society as a whole. Now, there are prevalent arguments, some of y'all might have heard these floating around in academia, like the biological determinist arguments, which would lead us to believe that it is in our human nature for men to be dominant and women to be subordinate. Now, these ideologies lead to beliefs that men are the ones who make history, that they are the subjective factor, while women are merely passive objects to be acted upon. Now, this is a very convenient explanation for a social order that is built upon inequality among a few people at the top and a vast majority at the bottom. You have to think about it. If class divisions can only exist because these divisions are internally fostered at the bottom, it is not that a male worker benefits from the oppression of a female worker, but that capitalists and the 1% benefit from this in a myriad of ways. Lucy Parsons, to give a little shout out, was a labor organizer from right here in Chicago, and I think she put it best. She said, "We, working women, are slaves of slaves. We are exploited more ruthlessly than men, but we must break the twofold yoke." In what became the founding document of feminist theory, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels drew upon the work of an anthropologist named Lewis Henry Morgan and came to the conclusion, based on research, that primitive communism, that is a society with more or less egalitarian social relations, accounted for somewhere 90% of human history. Now, if this is correct, then it has revolutionary implications because it would mean that things like greed and warfare are not rooted in our biology or in individual men. And this means that women's oppression is not something that has to exist. It must therefore be rooted in something else, class society. If women's oppression is rooted in the rise of class society, then what is necessary to achieve women's liberation is the abolition and overthrow of class society. Now, this will lead us into a more specialized focus of the economics of oppression.
In this age of economic crisis and austerity, our government, on the one hand, pays hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out banks and other corporations that created and continue to perpetuate this crisis, while continuing to roll back the gains of the women's rights movement, of course using the language shared sacrifice. This makes the working class and poor pay for the ruling class's crisis and creates an extraordinary burden on working women, working men, and their offspring. This creates an even more unstable family system. So while capitalism necessitates the nuclear family, it tears out from beneath its feet the very foundation of the family. As a young woman who was born and raised by my single young mother, I witnessed her prosper and succeed in society to an extent, but not without great struggle, and the ability to overcome many obstacles, whether financial, social, career-oriented, or otherwise. These obstacles would not have been present had she been part of a privileged group, that of dominance or inherited wealth. As an adolescent, I developed a keen interest in gender issues, and it was only natural for me to build on those interests through education. I have taken women's studies classes at Columbia College here in Chicago, and have since broadened my horizons, cultivating a much more well-rounded understanding of gender oppressions and the roots of such oppressions. I have recently transferred to Northeastern Illinois University to major in justice studies with a minor in women's studies. Through my studies, I've found that women today are still only paid 76 cents for and that's 68 cents for African American women and 58 cents for Latino women to a man's dollar. The Wage Project, Women Are Getting Even, created by a national organization for women, looked exclusively at full-time workers, which estimated that women with a high school diploma could lose as much as $700,000 over a lifetime. Women with a college degree lose $1.2 million, and women professional school graduates lose $2 million. This means college debt is also more burdensome to women than men. The fact that women earn less makes paying for education and paying back student loans a longer and more difficult task and prevents women from paying off debt at the rate that men do. But it doesn't stop there. These inequalities follow women into retirement years, if they even have the ability to retire, and reduces their financial resources such as Social Security benefits, pensions, and savings. This heavy wage gap does not only hurt women, but men as well, making it a tool to instigate lower wages across the board for all workers. During this latest so-called depression, men lost more jobs than women, but during our recession recovery, women have been thrown under the bus because of budget cuts to healthcare and education. Public sector jobs, including teaching and healthcare, are facing intense and detrimental cutbacks, jobs that are predominantly held by women. In education, women made up 76% of teachers in the 2007-2008 school year. The American Federation of Teachers, a labor union, represents 1.5 million members, 73% of whom are female. There is a laundry list of politicians from Capitalism's A and B team, also known as Democrats and Republicans, seeking to roll back the clock on working class and poor women. Since taking office in January 2010, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie cut New Jersey school aid by $1.3 billion. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker managed to restrict collective bargaining rights for public employees, including university hospital workers, home health aides, and daycare providers, but not for police or firefighters. Both male-dominated fields. Limiting collective bargaining could also jeopardize flexible work hours and maternity leave. In 2011, Republican lawmakers proposed fund cuts for Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program, more widely known as WIC. The program provides federal grants to states for food, healthcare referrals, nutrition education for low-income pregnant women, and post-pregnant women with children up to 5 years of age who are found to be at nutritional risk. This program helps protect about 9 million people, low-income women and children. This past year, their budget was cut $504 million. Taking away programs such as this is devastating to poor and working-class women and their children who cannot afford proper health care or substantial nutrition. But what tops all of this? After months of work by House Democrats on Obama's Affordable Health Care for America Act of 2010, the floor debate on the bill risks being overshadowed by internal disputes among Democrats over the issue of abortion. In the end, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi decided that abortion opponents should be allowed to offer an amendment that would impose tighter restrictions on abortions that could be offered through a new government-run insurance plan and through private insurance that is bought using government subsidies. Sponsored primarily by Michigan Representative and Democrat Brit Schulte and Nebraska Democrat Senator Ben Nelson, the amendment to legislation passed. What does this now mean? First off, that the Democrats aren't the party that will usher forth women's liberation. But then it explicitly bans abortion coverage from the government-run plan. It also essentially prevents private insurers from selling plans on the National Health Insurance Exchange that cover abortion. So women who intend to use government subsidies for health care costs are forced to switch plans. Additionally, if a woman's employer were to start offering coverage under the National Health Insurance Exchange, she could potentially have to switch plans. There's no public option in the bill. The amendment requires individuals purchasing new plans through state-run exchanges to pay separately for any abortion coverage. This forces insurance plans to drop abortion coverage if they want the massive amount of new business that will come from the individual mandate. There's no such thing as a single-item abortion coverage plan because no one expects to have an unwanted pregnancy. Also, states are allowed to bar individuals from purchasing abortion coverage through the exchange. And just this week, Planned Parenthood suffered another slash in funds. In an alarmingly ironic and disgusting move, the Susan G. Komen for the Cure organization severed ties with Planned Parenthood to eliminate future funding for breast cancer screenings and education. Komen grants to Planned Parenthood totaled $680,000 this past year and $580,000 the previous year. In doing so, the Komen for the Cure, an organization supposedly dedicated to improving and fighting for women's health and safety, has put hundreds of thousands of women's lives at risk due a huge slap in the face to women who need affordable health services. Do not be fooled by Komen's arguments to back this decision. This was a politically motivated move, as Komen was feeling the pressure from anti-women and anti-abortion lobbyists. When it comes to health care, we have to ask ourselves, in whose interest does the system really serve?
Which brings us expressly to the necessity of abortion rights and bodily autonomy. In order for women to be truly equal and have full participation in society, we need to be in control of our reproductive bodies. Reproductive freedom has been under attack since the inception of the American Medical Association's self-propelled dominance of medicinal practice. Before the Medical Association and in the times of the earliest settlers here, abortion was not only legal, but it was also openly advertised and commonly performed. It wasn't until the late 1800s, when many immigrant families began making their way into the U.S., that states began to pass laws making abortion illegal. Some of these laws were passed based on the fear that too many immigrant children would be born, as their birth rates were higher than that of the white English Protestant women. And so the racist lawmakers devised a restriction to keep women from aborting. As these laws took effect, science and technology advanced, conquering and changing medical practice, thus making surgical procedures safer and more effective. This did not, however, include abortion procedures. Now, this is where the term back alley abortion comes in. New developments and advancements triggered doctors to vie for exclusive rights to practice medicine in order to phase out their competition, midwives, apothecaries, and homeopaths. Once the American Medical Association was established, they deemed abortion immoral and dangerous as a way to stamp out their competitors' most important and frequent procedure while simultaneously seizing control of women's bodies. women still sought abortions, but at a much higher and more frightening cost. Many of these women died or had severe medical problems as the result of these back-alley abortion methods that they were reduced to accept. Taking away a woman's right to an abortion did not reduce the number of women who had them, just based on the number of those who suffered injury and died. Now, moving forward in history, Roe v. Wade gave women the legal choice in 1973. But barely 3 years after that victory, Congress responded with the Hyde Amendment in 1976, which prevents certain federal funds from being used to pay for abortions. This amendment expressly targets women on Medicaid and low-income women, making it extremely difficult to obtain an abortion, even in cases of rape, incest, or if the woman's health is at risk. Every year since then, abortion rights and proper reproductive health care for women in general has been revised, bullied, and manipulated by way of gingerly worded bills and amendments. Right now, and this is actually a really shocking number, 87% of counties in the U.S. do not have any abortion clinics. So not only are abortion rights restricted and services expensive for many, they are absolutely unattainable in areas where clinics are non-existent. So this specifically prevents poor and working class women from accessing much needed health care. After all, abortion is a healthcare issue, and this talk is not going to censor it from, talks of healthcare like the right wing does. So let's take a closer look at a one-percenter stance on my bodily autonomy. The Republican creep Rick Santorum, which you can hiss when you hear hiss, yeah, has pledged to repeal federal funding for contraception, safe sex programs, and other forms of birth control if elected president. This misogynist has used his candidacy platform to primarily victim blame, saying that women should make the best out of a bad situation, referring to rape, and attack poor women's rights to abortion because only his wife, with the support of their family and resources, can handle the procedure. The agenda of the 1% is clear. It's waging war on women's bodies, and in doing so, it's committing itself to a war on the poor. Make no mistake, the same policies that assault women's bodily autonomy and reproductive freedoms also prove to be major blows to the already damaged ways of life for the working class as a whole.
The government of the 1% and its bankster cohorts wage economic warfare on women and their families every day. Every day, poor and working class people are denied quality housing, education, healthy food, clean water, non-toxic air, and health care by our own government. Every day, this results in poor living conditions which disproportionately affect women. This is economic violence. More women face entering into sex work not of their own volition, but because of their economic circumstances. Society pushes women into this work, but then degrades, devalues, and morally condemns them for it. We are socialized by powerful sources in our world to play the roles prescribed by an inequitable social system. This is the basis of a violent society. If women had the unchallenged ability to control their reproductive means and were compensated for work equally in society, the ruling class would lose its manufacturers of the next generation of poor workers. That is why capitalism has an interest in the continued oppression of women. Capitalism is inherently invested in creating sexist rhetoric to keep women in their place, which leads to the manifestation of sexism and rape culture propagated by the 1%'s media and their need to sell and commodify sex for profit. So are we living under a capitalist rape culture? If rape culture describes a culture in which rape and sexual violence are common and in which prevalent attitudes, norms, practices, and media condone, normalize, excuse, or tolerate sexual violence, I would wager that we're in it. Other examples commonly associated with rape culture include victim blaming, sexual objectification, and trivializing rape. Yeah, sounds like the 1%'s take on things. We can look at 2 cases in Chicago that highlight not only victim blaming and a failing system, but shed light on how the enforcers of the 1%, the police, play a role in women's oppression. For nearly 2 years, Tijuana Moore has endured the system's failures. First, she was sexually molested by a police officer, and then when she sought justice for this offense, she found herself in the clutches of the state's attorney, charged with 2 Class 1 felonies for eavesdropping, facing up to 15 years in prison. Fortunately, Moore was later acquitted of these ridiculous charges, but had to pay a high price in the process, being harassed and degraded due to her race, social identity, and irrelevant events of her past. Her credibility was under scrutiny, and although she was acquitted, she has yet to receive justice from the original crime committed by our so-called protectors, the police. By the way, this is not an isolated incident. Chicago has finally seen the indictment of two 23rd District officers, Paul Clavijo and Juan Vasquez, on counts of criminal sexual assault and official misconduct. The officers have been charged with raping a 22-year-old woman, identified as only Jane Doe, in her apartment in Rogers Park after offering her a ride home at 3 a.m. on March 30th, 2011. Both officers have an extensive history of complaints and charges filed against them for acts of sexual violence and harassment. So what can we glean from these examples? The cops are not on our side. They are here to protect the interests of the 1% and in turn are protected by the 1%. They have the courts, the laws, and the resources to get away with rape, murder, and torture. We in the Occupy movement need to voice our disgust at the crimes of the police and highlight other cases of police brutality, racism, sexism, and harassment that the police use against the most vulnerable communities in Chicago.
If we take a look at the past year, we see women playing leading roles in the fight for their liberation. Whether it be in Tunisia, Egypt, Wisconsin, or the Occupy movement, the women within these movements are making their own demands. When we look at these struggles and the re-energized fights around women's rights seen with the International Slut Walks and Walk for Choice, we can see the key to ending women's oppression. The key to ending women's oppression is struggle. A struggle to bring an end to capitalism, to end the subjugation of the many by the few in favor of the many determining their own courses, both collectively and as individuals. It's a struggle to end the 1%'s domination of our lives. We must remember that sexism is only one of many systematic tools of oppression that is used by the 1% to keep the working class and poor people divided. The 1% wants us to internalize and reproduce this hate. And as people committed to the fight for a better world, we have to be just as diligent in the fight against sexism. We can combat this sexist society in a number of ways through the vehicle of Occupy. We need to constantly reiterate the importance of survivor empowerment and grassroots organizing to fight against instances of systematic sexual violence. We should be standing up for full access and free reproductive health care services like contraceptives and abortion. And we should be demanding equal pay for equal work and fighting to have domestic labor recognized and compensated for by the state. We should be challenging the rape culture that's propagated by the media and sponsored by the 1%. And we can help by creating spaces for political education and development within our movement about our history and the struggle for women's liberation. After all, with historical examples ranging from the Russian Revolution of 1917 to the female Black Panthers of the 1960s and 70s, there is so much we can learn from our past movement's gains and losses. And I want to take some time to stress how important organization, agitation, and education are to the fight for women's liberation and to all struggles, as a matter of fact. In order to fully realize our goals and demands for equality and justice, we need to systematically engage with our own history. I want to take some time to point out some particular badass moments in our historical fight for women's liberation, all right, because everybody enjoys these. We're going to go with three big ones. So at the dawn of the political era in 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley wrote her Vindication of the Rights of Women. This period saw women for the first time in meaningful ways projecting their social consciousness onto society. Wollstonecraft was responding to educational and political theorists of the 18th century who actively believed that women did not need to receive an education. She argued that women ought to have an education commensurate with their position in society, claiming that women were essential to the nation because they educated its children and because they could be companions to their husbands rather than mere wives. Instead of viewing women as ornaments to society or property to be traded in marriage, Wollstonecraft maintained that women are human beings, deserving of the same fundamental rights as men. Now, this treaty was incredibly revolutionary for its time, although we probably tweaked some language. So, moving on, the Paris Commune of 1871. It was a state created by and for the people, without a standing army or bureaucracy. All officials, including judges, were elected and subject to recall, and were all paid workers' wages. The Women's Union of the Paris Commune participated in many municipal commissions, organized cooperative workshops, and formed schools. They demanded gender equality, wage equality, the right of divorce for women, and the right to secular education and professional education for girls. They also demanded suppression of the distinction between married women and concubines. And when Versailles troops were sent to attack and take back the Commune's defenses, women were the first to defend the cannons and the Commune schools against the military. They were the first to lead, and in most cases, the first targeted for execution by the military. Moving on to 1917, we saw a mass demonstration of Petrograd women on International Women's Day. Led by a group of striking women textile workers, they marched on the Municipal Duma demanding bread. They called on their husbands and their brothers to join them. 90,000 workers went on strike that day, demanding bread and end to the war and down with the Tsar and police. Women's International Day is what initiated their February Revolution. Revolutionaries Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Alexandra Kollontai played critical roles in organizing the German Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks. Now, our women's rights movement has been gutted from corporate-sponsored textbooks. I'm sure many of you, as did I, did not learn about these instances in our developing years in school. We need to inject our history of struggle back into this dehistoricized society, and Occupy is posed to do just this. We need to be even more organized in our reaching out to other groups, trying to realize our same goals, our same demands, and broaden our base towards equity. We need to educate ourselves, continue doing teach-ins and study groups to understand the lessons of the past and glean from them what we can for the here and the now. But equally important is the need to continue to agitate based on our convictions. We should continue to support actions like the one that the Gender Equity Committee held just last weekend in opposition to the anti-woman, anti-queer, anti-poor soil conference. I see some folks, shout out ladies who were there. So it was awesome, and we need to keep empowering our female comrades. Like, this should be a place of empowerment. Occupy should be a place of empowerment for all, but especially for our female identifying comrades. We need to feel safe, we need to feel respected here, because our fight is your fight, and your fight is our fight. And this wouldn't be a talk on women's and human liberation if we didn't include that old saying, an injury to one is an injury to all. It perfectly encapsulates the nature of Occupy. It's what it's all about. The 99% coming together to demand an alternative to this broken system and make our voices heard. It's solidarity in action. We need to continue to foster this solidarity and promote it within our movement actively. So the question then is, can the oppressed and exploited really end women's oppression? And we will say, by the very existence of struggles of the oppressed and exploited against their own oppression and own exploitation, that the answer is yes. Women's liberation isn't just a chapter in our movement or side work that we do, over here, and then we go over here to our other side work. The fight must be comprehensive, and we need to think of the struggles for gender, race, age, ability, and queer equality as our own struggles. We see these fights, like we see them every day in the work that we're doing around us, but we need to see more clearly the interconnectedness of struggle against oppression and exploitation. There is no making half a revolution. So we have quite a bit of time for discussion. It's only 3:35. We've got the place until 4:30, so there can be a lot of dialogue that happens. And I think, sister, remind me your name.
I'm Dana.
Okay, Dana.
I'm on the education committee.
Awesome.
I actually do the Twitters.
Sweet. Oh, so glad to have you with us.
Anyone have a pen?
Yeah.
Yes.
We got a pen easily available.
Somebody.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So, you want to explain how it works?
So we'll take stack for discussion and comments. I'll write down your name and we'll go in order. If someone hasn't spoken before, we'll let them go before other people who've spoken a lot, just so we keep it equal and everyone gets a chance to say something. All right? Who'd like to go first?
My name is Dan. I like that you guys brought up the Susan Coleman thing, and especially since it just happened this week. I just was reading the news earlier, and they responded, as of today, they responded to the backlash, but at the same time, the response is total bullshit. Like,
right.
they said, oh, well, we won't say that we're going to specifically deny these grants, but then they also won't say that they're going to renew the grants.
Right.
So I thought that was an interesting thing where like they responded, and so that's going to, for some people, that's like going to kind of stave them off, you know what I mean? But we need to remember, like, you responded, but your response is still bullshit.
Right.
And it's a reason to even fight back harder. Like, you can't just like swat us away by saying, oh, okay, well, we're going to just change our language. Basically, you're doing the same thing.
Yes. Recording. He asked that we repeat things if we can't exactly hear it. So there is, this is going to be kind of awkward. So basically, Nick brought up that Susan G. Komen's response to everybody basically like coming at them with, why are you defunding Planned Parenthood? Why are you taking away these valuable resources? Their response was total bullshit. Kind of being more in the neutral ground of saying, well, we won't say that we are defunding, but we won't say that we're keeping the funds, etc. And then that we got to realize that that's just utter bullshit.
Mostly that the whole thing is a total contradiction to what they're out there trying to do in the first place. So yeah, it makes me very angry. It should make all of you very angry.
Next person. Okay, go ahead, sir. And if anyone else like wants to go after the person who's speaking, you can just raise your hand like that, and I'll write you down.
I'd like to bring up a little local history, also how the women's movement developed after the 60s. Came out of SDS, the sense that women were, on one sense, empowered, on the other hand, also the ones around the mimeograph machines, whose ideas were not paid attention to in meetings. And there was a paper by two women, Casey Hayden and Mary King, in 1965, about caste and class, and that was one of the first beginnings of the women's movement with what we call third wave feminism. In Chicago, there was the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, which existed from 1969 to 1976. They did a whole lot in that time. They had an underground abortion service before abortion was legal. It was called Jane. I worked with them then. They sponsored self-defense classes for women, so women would not be intimidated on the streets. Auto repair classes for women, so women could know how to take care of their own cars and wouldn't be taken advantage of by mechanics. They had women's sports teams. They had a marvelous graphics collective that produced a lot of posters. I have one of the Chicago Women's Labor History that went with back with a slideshow. And it's good to know about those precedents.
So I can't do justice to Frank's presentation just then about the history of the Chicago women's rights movement, but he touched on Jane, which everybody should look up. There's an incredible book called Abortion Wars, and I really encourage everybody to check that text out. It's a compilation of essays that span from the 50s, I think, to like 88 or 89, and it specifically looks at just different women's experiences who were organizing and the fights that and the obstacles that they were encountering at the time of organizing, and then also reflecting now, so they're all still with us, and reflecting on the fights that are still needing to be won.
I'd like to ask you for your opinions and your experiences on the role of women within the Occupy. I, from standing over here, see a large number of women involved in central kinds of decision-making committees and whatnot, but I'm not you, so I'd like to get your ideas. And do we need to do anything better?
Mark, did you want to step on that?
Oh no, a separate question. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, just, I mean, like I'm an individual, working within a collective group of folks, but I can tell you, like, it's astounding to see for the first time in organizing. I've been an organizer for like 7 or 8 years, and I'm actually seeing more and more women radicalizing and like injecting themselves into politics, into movement work. It's quite possibly the most heartening thing like ever. That being said, all movements bring with them the muck of society, right? Like we all have to actively work within our movement work, within ourselves, at countering all of the bullshit that they heap and just like put on us, right? And that being said, I don't want this talk to turn into like a blaming individuals thing, because I do think that what Occupy is doing is maintaining a really correct response. It's saying like this is a systemic issue, right? And while we can't actively work to create safe and respectful spaces, we can always do better. There have been instances, that we can definitely try to shore up. I think that, recognizing sexist language, sexist rhetoric is important. We need to constantly check ourselves on that. Women also aren't like, excluded from internalizing sexism, internalizing, violent language had to keep ourselves not only in check, but keep the movement in check. And that comes through political education, that comes through experience, through struggle, you know what I mean? We learn about each other when we fight beside each other. It's what solidarity is about. And I think that, understanding the politics of solidarity and struggling next to, female identifying folks, queer identifying folks, the list goes on, we learn about different folks, and we learn about how our struggles are connected, and that makes us feel much more cohesive in the movement forward. And so I think, there are always hang-ups, there are always problems, and I think that what we can work towards those, creating a safe and respectful environment where we can all push the movement forward.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious to hear one or the other, or both of you guys, to discuss your take on the idea of the role of men in women's empowerment and, the support of liberation of women. Specifically with the sort of notion that I've encountered or I've discussed with various people, something interesting can happen where, as a man, for example, there could be a compulsion to defend or to jump in, intervene, let's say, in a moment of some sort of repression. But there's also a potential there for kind of a unintended legitimization of a kind of paternalism, oh hey, here's the woman being shouted down, let the man come in and set it straight, kind of thing, right? But at the same time, there's the other side of that is a genuine desire to do something appropriate in that circumstance. So I wonder if you could just discuss that a little bit in a very general, open-ended way.
Well, that's kind of a sensitive thing. You don't want to be too overbearing, but we're all going to need each other's backs, so we need men. We should not think of it as gender helping another gender, just we're all helping each other, and that would be the solution. Don't be afraid to help, don't be afraid to intervene, just don't be overbearing and sexist about it.
Just to add briefly, I think that that exists, right? We're taught, we're socialized to believe that it's defender, protector, and oh God, damsel in distress, and it sounds cliche, but that shit is on every billboard, you know what I mean? It's on every train advertisement. We see it, we're bombarded with it, and again, it permeates the fabric of our society. I will say that there is that tendency, but I will also say that there are times when people need to be called out on their shit, and you might be there at the right place at the right time to call people out on their shit. And I do think that you should, in a way just be she can fucking handle it. You know what I mean? And be there, and I think that there's a way to respect that kind of organic, broaching of, hostility and aggression that I myself possess. And, you know what I mean? So I think it's always good to be able to have each other's backs, as Erica was saying, but at the same time, some room to breathe, some room to handle the situation ourselves. And if shit gets out of hand, we need everybody on board, because it's we saw when the march, God, that was months ago, somebody threw something, on glass, and we collectively as a unit, not as individuals, shamed that person out of it, saying no, shame, this is nonviolence, this is what we're doing. And as a united whole, as a collective unit, we were able to get that person out, get that violence out, and then reroute and have our demonstration continue on. I think that that's in the spirit of that, having that kind of unified presence and that collective will forward is always stronger than saying let's isolate, let's have just groups, certain groups handle certain things. So it's tenuous, and I will say it definitely is there's a specific time and place for all that kind of stuff. But if you feel if you're consciously active and aware of that, and you're about to, and you're ooh, that probably means hold back. You know what I mean? That probably means hold back, see how things play out, but be there for support, because we all need it.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what you said earlier about women playing a role in Occupy, and this is something that happened, and for me, having I think been one of those people who stands up a lot at General Assemblies, who tries to be active, it isn't easy, and there are a lot of times that I have felt incredibly attacked for being a woman. There are times when, and I actually composed a whole list of things that were said about me or done to me. There were a few people who were joking around about how I apparently like controlled people's minds with my vagina, and that's how I got them to agree to my proposal. And you know what? That's just really disrespectful. And the thing is, actually, and much worse than that. And I think that it's really just key to remember that. And I think that what's important is that a lot of people think that the fight for women's rights is over.
Right.
And that like women have rights, and in a lot of ways that people say we live in a post-race, racial society. It's just not true. And it's not that I'm asking for special rights. It's that it's that I think that the hostility towards women is often much more deeply ingrained in society, and the things that arise. Like people being disrespectful or condescending at meetings, or being protected in situations where they shouldn't be, are just things that they don't think are offensive and can be. At the same time, to respond to Mark's thing, it's as I always try to tell my male friends, stand with me, don't stand in front of me. Don't stand in front of me and be like, you can't handle the situation. Stand next to me and be like, what don't fuck with my friend. Yeah.
So I put myself on track. I just wanted why not? Just to sort of go along off of what you said last about building solidarity between men and women in Occupy. A lot of work has to be done too within women themselves. In relation to white women and women of color, because women of color deal with a whole other set of issues that can't be, prioritized. We experience them all simultaneously. So I think a good example is at a slut walk. I think the last one that was in New York, they had someone made a sign with the John Lennon song lyric on it about women are the niggers of the world or something similar to that. But I think people have to think before they do things like that, even if it isn't coming from a malicious standpoint. You have to, I think if you don't consider what could be offensive to women of color, then you get into a back and forth about what is considered, what is considered offensive, and you can't tell someone else what they consider offensive. So I think that's something else to consider as well. Next up is.
Let's see here. For one thing, you said internalize it. I can't tell you how many times I say guys, even if it's a whole group of women, and it's especially if I'm in a rush, it's like, hey guys, and it's that's my biggest problem as far as I can see, because I catch it way too late. And then the other thing is, as far as how do you respond as a male and someone's being sexist to a female, and you want to stop it but you're not quite sure. The biggest thing is I can't tell you how many times I've been talking to a guy, and there's a guy happened to stand next to me, and all of a sudden the guy sees, oh, another guy, let me direct questions at him. Why does this woman keep thinking? And how do you can either ignore them, or you can be like, you got to ask her, I'm not involved in this, you got to respect her, or something like that, but probably ignore it, so that I can take control and be like, look at me, this fight is between us. And oh man, I'm really interested in how people internalize it. That's kind of what I want to actually study. So the media, and I lost my train of thought, so I'm gonna just
I wanted to respond, and I was going to say that this is kind of weird, filming myself. I was going to say that actually everybody else said it way better than I was going to, and I wanted to say that if a man was to as a man, I try to be I want to be conscious to not use my privilege, speaking over people, and try to create a level playing field. I guess. I don't know. That's not very articulate, but.
Yeah, I really like Mark's, I like that you started this kind of conversation, and as most of my experience in activism was with the queer community, and it was with Join the Impact, and the way that Join the Impact started was two of my friends and I posted, or my friend posted on a blog, and the next day we were organizers of a march, and I had never been active before. So it was I was thrown into a position of leadership without really the background to even have that position of leadership. But then I got used to that. And a few years went by, and things, of course, things changed, and the movement progressed, ups and downs. And then I started dating a guy that was undocumented. And so then I became interested and involved in somewhat, not super heavily, but for a little while there were a few events, like the March 10th event they do every year. I was involved with some of the planning meetings. And I didn't know how to sit in that room as an ally, as a white man, yes, a queer man, but a white man with papers, with a lot of privilege, and a white man that also passes as straight somehow, you know what I mean? So somehow. And it was a really tough experience, and it just made me think of this whole conversation about Occupy hopefully getting more fused with the women's liberation movement, for the men in Occupy. It is hard. It's hard to sit back and let the people of that movement lead that movement. The women's liberation movement should be led by women and people identifying as women, and the men in that movement, in my opinion, should be you need to get used to playing a supporting role. And I just think that that's kind of I don't know how to articulate really I don't know, I just feel like the work that I experienced with the immigration movement forced me to shut up, sit down, shut up. This person speaking knows best about what they're talking about. They live this day to day, and once you learn how to just shut up, then I don't know, it kind of you have to find an inner zen point, and then you'll know when it hits a point where you need to step in, when someone, And I found to get my aggression out, it would be outside of the organizing meetings, talking to people who weren't involved in the immigration movement. And that's when I would be able to be an ally and lead as an ally with those conversations outside of that, with people that weren't as in touch with politics or ignorant, so to speak, you know what I mean?
So you touched on legislation about abortion and how a lot of our legislators view it, and I'm wondering how you view this issue, because the way that I see it is there's a very large percentage of people in this country who are of a religious nature, and that dictates a lot of their policies, and that plays a big role in abortion, but it also plays a role in Indiana just yesterday passed they're going to allow creationism in school. And so a lot of that is driven from this fundamental Christian belief. And so I'm wondering, do you, by focusing solely on, abortion and women's rights, is that just the one aspect of it, or should the true goal be to educate and get this religious mindset completely kicked out of our political system? I mean, which is a larger fight, I guess?
Yeah, so to stack on that a little bit, or do you want to I think we're on tenuous ground, right? Because, so just to preface, I identify as a non-believer. I think it's, whatever.
Right.
But we also have to acknowledge in the greater span of the development of struggle and the development of fight back, and in any number of fights, a lot of people leading the way are going to be people who believe in something, right? So getting that out of the way, I'm not a hostile, AKA militant atheist, and I'm just they piss me off, they do, to no end, the fundamentalists, but at the same time, I really don't think that at its core, they are really that motivated by religion. I think mostly they're motivated by profit, lobbyist interest groups and things of that nature. I think that they cloak it very, very well in a moral high ground. They cloak it very well in this kind of oh, but my higher being tells me. I really don't think that they go home at night and pray. Just gonna say that. I really don't think that they do. I think that they count their $100 bills. They burn them. They wipe their asses with them. You know what I mean? I think that what we have